It is safe to say that as an adventurer, Steve Spellslinger made quite the impact on the world around him, sometimes intentionally, and other times very much at random. Even his less popular adventures with the other members of Doom are often told locally, as it was very rare for him to sweep through a region and not leave some sort of impression upon the locals. In later years, his tactics would change, and he'd move around the world with far more subtlety. But those earlier years, he took to shaking up the established and traditional at virtually every opportunity. For if one thing set Steve off, it was to tell him something was only done a specific way because it was how it had always been done. This at times led to all sorts of mix-ups, from his refusal to simply take things as they were and hold true to old ways. What this meant was that at times the members of Doom would unleash ancient and terrible evils upon the world that had been long forgotten, and those old rituals actually had a purpose. Once or twice they unleashed an ancient and great good upon the world as well. Then there was the time they unleashed an ancient fart upon the world. It had been left behind as a prank by the old god Hamker, the prankster, before his followers were all killed by followers of other gods for being insufferably annoying. But it also led to good things, as sometimes old methods and rituals were overly complicated and needed change, but no one wanted to instigate this change. Aside from Steve, of course. However, Steve wasn't just an adventurer. He was also a mage, and often had to shout that at people while casting magic in their face to get them to believe it. Part of being a mage working for the Archon of Magic meant he wasn't just an adventurer. He had to work with the patrol of lawful, incredible creature enforcement, often to keep the magical creatures of Talaron in check. Not to mention his duties as a teacher at Orbitus, which ended with predictably disastrous yet informative results at first. But at times he made his own life more difficult, both intentionally and unintentionally. One such event was his angering of the fairies that lived in the humans' realms of the eastern continents. For the long-established fairies who loved to bring whimsical and magical gifts and quests to the humans who lived in these lands took exception to Spellslinger's efforts to undo all of their annoying bullshit mumbo-jumbo fuckery, as the infamous Spellslinger put it, especially when he offered his services across the realm as an item decursifier, offering to let anyone who receives a magic boon from a fairy to have him inspect it and remove any curses or effects that would cause them undue harm, or morality lessons. These events, combined with his work disrupting and perverting the prophecies and plans of the god of fate, strained the fairies' willingness to operate in human lands. Especially since the fairies worked hand in hand with the god of fate quite often, since tales of princes and princesses would never be complete in their eyes without a heavy heaping of fate, destiny, and manipulation. Normally, it was the job of the Archon of Magic to step in and help ease and soothe these tensions. But in this case, she decided to use the fairies going on strike to promote Orbitus further, promising to take over the functions of the fairies in these now abandoned human territories. So of course, Steve had to help fix what he had broken. This is the story not about Spellsling the adventurer, but of Spellslinger the fairy godfather. Where the fuck am I? Steve wondered aloud as he looked around the village, placed precariously along the cliffside of a deep ravine. The castle that overlooked the village was his destination, but he had never seen the banners before, or had any clue just where he was. The quest scroll left for him in his room by the Archon had simply said to come to the set teleportation coordinates to fulfill his task at the castle, but he wasn't sure what his task was. He felt like he'd been deprived of some crucial information. Since he'd been expecting some sort of official function, he'd even shown up in his toga instead of his usual adventuring clothes, though he was wearing clothes under the toga since this high mountain plateau was rather cold. The people in the village stared at him as he passed, watching him with a mix of confusion and concern, it seemed. Most of the time, people just ignored him since he blended in rather well with the local populace when adventuring. That, and he was usually standing next to Fenrina, the were-husky, or his girlfriend Sherry, the half-succubus, so they were much more interesting to stare at than a human. But here it was like he'd grown a second head the way they would watch him and retreat into their homes and businesses as he passed by. He was about to ask someone about it when he realized he was at the front gate of the rather small, unimpressive castle. Good defensive position, though, he noted. "Hey," "You're the fairy, right?" one of the guards asked as he approached, which made Steve growl out in return. "Fuck you, pal. I'm Almarin. This is a toga, not a dress, and skirts are plenty manly. Gives you total freedom of movement. And what happens in our bathhouses is totally between us." Steve glared and then blinked as he saw the confused look on the guards' faces. "Oh, wait, you mean like a fairy? No, I'm a mage. Yes, a human mage. Deal with it." "Ah, we were told to expect some sort of human fairy from Orbitus." The guard tried next, still seeming confused. "Well, I'm a human from Orbitus, but a fairy is a species. I'm the same as you two, only older, and magic, and Almarin, but I'm certainly not a fairy." He rambled a bit before trailing off. He just looked at the guards and they looked back at him. "Shall I head inside?" he finally asked, and they backed up to let him through. He was looking around the courtyard of the castle when he heard someone call out to him. "Oh, you're Zavaria!" He sighed as he realized that was probably going to stick as he looked around to see a short, heavy woman with her hair coiled into thick buns. He couldn't help but notice that her weight made her very bouncy as she approached him, and he wondered if she had magic-infused clothing that was preventing her from bouncing out of them. He was going to name her Bertha. "I might be, but I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, Bertha," he mentioned as he crossed his arms. "Oh, how did you know my name? OV, course. You're a wonderful magic fairy, yeah?" He was about to grin at being right about her name, but then frowned instead as she mentioned him being a magic fairy. "No, I'm magic, but I'm a human mage. From Orbitas. I was summoned here?" he asked as he held up the scroll. "Oh, yeah. The Qveen just had the child. You are here for the gifting ceremony. This way. She turned and began to bounce away from him as he followed along after her, wondering what it was he was supposed to give. Or were they giving him something? He examined the castle as they walked into the main keep and noticed it was, well, shabby. It was reasonably clean, but there were only a few banners, and he noticed a distinct lack of giant, impressive tables, not to mention suits of armor or statues or other displays of wealth and power. He'd also only seen the two guards outside. Normally, the kings and queens he'd had to deal with were surrounded by scores of soldiers. They headed up a set of stairs behind the main room then, and he finally saw two more guards standing before a door. But Bertha didn't even slow down as she opened the door they were guarding and headed through, waving Steve along. Inside, he saw a slight man with some sort of circlet on his head, sitting on a nice chair, while four other men in decently clean clothes stood to the side, and there were another two men behind the nice chair. Bertha stood off to the side then, and everyone was staring at Steve, who blinked and looked around. It took him a moment, but he realized then, this was a throne room. Or it was supposed to be. The circlet for a crown, and the nice chair that was hardly a throne, threw him off a bit. Though he noticed the window on the right side of the room had a gorgeous view over the side of the cliff and the ravine and river below. One of the men to the side coughed nervously before Steve finally spoke up. "I don't know why I'm here. I just got this scroll in my room." He trailed off as he realized how lame that sounded and then started over. "I mean, I was summoned by the powerful spheres of magic. Woo!" He made a spell-casting gesture with his hands for a moment. "But, really? Why am I here?" He stepped his fingers together and looked around as the rather slight-looking king spoke up. We contacted Orbitus for a fairy godfather for the gifting ceremony for my child." The king sounded about as confident about what was going on as Steve. Yeah, very GodFather," Bertha nodded. "Right. But I'm human?" Steve asked as he wasn't sure how to put it. "Yeah, it's the best mage we could afford," Bertha chimed in. "Well, the only mage we could afford," the king muttered, and Steve frowned. Could I just borrow your magic mirror? I need to make a call real quick," he asked as he tilted his head a bit. "Oh, sure, it's back here." The king got up off his rather nice chair then, as Steve could see the man was wearing a cloak that looked like it belonged on a much larger, more impressive person as he headed around the chair and to a door Steve didn't notice behind it. Steve followed along then as the king led him deeper into the castle, and then to door on the right of the hall. Normally, magic mirrors were in large, opulent rooms to show off and highlight the wealth or power of the person who owned it. But when Steve stepped into the room, he blinked at how empty the room was. There was a small chair before the smallest magic mirror Steve had ever seen. It was more like the magic makeup mirror. Even so, Steve leaned in and tapped on it, quickly casting the frequency for the Archdean's private line as he peered in close, squinting to see the image on the tiny mirror. "This is the Archdean of Arbitus. Who dare disturbo? Hello, Steve. Where are you calling me from? I can barely see you." Steve saw her lean in towards her own magic mirror back in her office, her ethereal body now filled with an image of the stars of the night sky. He liked that look on her. I'm here in Uberberg." Steve jumped a little as he looked back to see the king standing in the doorway still. "This is Uberberg. I'm king of all the cities of this fine nation. Which is this one, and also Unterboob." "Under what?" Steve asked in surprise before shaking his head and waving. "Never mind. Thank you, guy. But, can I talk to my boss in private, please?" He jerked his thumb at the mirror and the king blinked. "Oh, yes! Sorry, let me just get the door." He closed the door for Steve then, and Steve waited until he heard his footsteps head back down the hall before turning back to the Archdean. "I got a quest scroll?" he mentioned and held it up before the tiny mirror. "Oh, yes. I've been briefing Karistan and Riava this morning. I was wondering where you were. You got hired before I could explain it seems. Let me see here." Steve saw her duck out of frame, and he could hear the rustling of papers on her desk. "You were hired as a fairy godfather for the newborn prince or possibly princess. Some of these human names, it's hard to tell if it's a boy or a girl." The Archdean trailed off as Steve spoke up. "Fairy godfather? What's going on?" "Oh, the fairies went on strike. Your campaign to uncurse all their items and ruin their plans drove them crazy." Steve grinned at the news, feeling very happy with himself since he hadn't heard yet. "So you're going to do their job for a while?" His smile faded as she told him that. "But I'm human. I'm not a fairy," he protested. "That's fine. You're magic. I'm hiring the services of our mages to replace the work done by the fairies. It should greatly increase our power and influence in the region. Kings, queens, and other form of nobility used to pay fairies to show up and bless their children with a gift of some sort. There's going to be more to your job, but for now, just do that and come back so I can explain more. One of the scribes I hired to handle this must have handled it early this morning. I didn't expect you to be hired this quickly or ever, honestly." She admitted, which made him frown. "Why not? They mentioned something about me being the only mage they could hire?" he asked then. "Yes. I set the fee for each of the available mages on a slide scale. You're the cheapest." Steve was about to curse, but she cut him off before he could. "For a reason. These are kings and queens we're talking about. They don't want the cheapest person for their child. They want the most expensive and prestigious options available, which is why I made you the cheapest, because I thought no one would hire you since I've got need of you for another task. Speaking of just give them something small and trivial and get out of there. I didn't even know this kingdom existed. I thought it was a smudge on the map." "Hey, well, first of all, fuck that. I might not be crazy about being a fairy godfather or having to help out royalty since you know my stance on how I feel about nobility." He began to take a breath as he raised a finger. "Everyone knows your stance on nobility, Stephen." The Archdean interrupted him, and he let the breath out, deflating a bit. "Well, anyway, I do good work. Whatever it is I'm doing. So poor king and queen or not, I'm gonna give them the best fucking present. Ever." He stood up and then sat back down, realizing the Archdean couldn't see him if he did that. You can't gift any known artifact-level items as that's not allowed by the rules. But sure, something you make? Go ahead. Just hurry up and report back. The Archdean cut the call then, and Steve got up as he rubbed his chin, trying to think of something he could do in a hurry that would be a good present. Then he snapped his fingers and headed back into the throne room. "Hey, sorry there was a bit of a mix-up, but I'll be right back. Bertha, this place has dogs somewhere, right?" He pointed at the servant as she blinked and nodded. "Great. Have any had litters that were born recently?" Bertha frowned at him and looked past for a moment, likely looking to her king before shrugging. I'm unsure? Well, lead the way to someone who'd know. He waved her out of the room, leaving behind the king and whoever was waiting to give their own gifts. They headed back down the stairs through the main room of the keep and into the courtyard where she led him off the side to the kennels. Steve had been raised around plenty of different animals on his family farm, and he was familiar with the dogs the Almarin army used, but he was always interested to find new breeds. So he was a bit excited that the dogs here were unfamiliar to him. They had black coats with white along the chest and a light brown on their limbs and around the muzzle a bit. And they were big. This would work perfectly. Ah, this is the kennel Meister Otto, Bertha said, then introducing him to a portly fellow with a beard that would put even those of some dwarves to shame. Hello. You are Zavaria? The man asked as Steve nodded, giving up on that particular battle. Yeah. Also, I've been wondering, what accent do you guys have? I'm not familiar. Oh, my apologies. The King's Common is much better than my own. Our people are known as burgers. When she said that, Steve just blinked and looked between them. Burgers? He asked. Yeah, burgers. Bertha echoed, but with a bit more clarity. Which means? He trailed off and waved around with his hands. Oh, mountain people. There are also the Waldburgers, Sumpfburgers, und Verklimptburgers, she said with a nod before Otto chimed up. Ja, und also the Brauburgers, which made Bertha nod and click her tongue. Yeah, how could I forget the Brauburgers? She asked with a laugh. Mostly common is spoken, but some of us get less practice. Yeah? Huh. I had no idea. How come I never hear your own language then? I've been through parts of Francomania, Steve mentioned. Oh, well, our language is silly, yeah? Common is much better, so we just speak common around visitors. We like ze practice. She nodded, and Otto let out an agreeable mutter as he nodded. Right. Well, these dogs, he pointed. What do you call them? Uberbergsenenhunds, Otto said, and Steve frowned as he thought several words had just been jammed together. Right. Well, did any litters recently have any runts or sickly pups? Any that didn't make it or might not last long? He asked, and knew that would sound odd even as Otto gave Bertha a look, but all she could do was shrug. Yeah, actually. 2. Sad things didn't make it. Otto nodded. Still have their bodies? Now the two really stared at him. But Steve didn't care. Otto pointed to a cloth off to the side of the kennels, and he approached, kneeling down as he drew one of his knives from the sleeves of his toga. He pulled the cloth back to see the 2 tiny bodies of the pups. He'd killed people, but the sight of small dead animals still upset him, even if it was from natural causes. Which was why he'd learned how to do something about it. He cut his right wrist sideways, hissing at the pain as blood began to flow forth. He rubbed his bleeding wrist across the face of one, then the other before muttering a small cantrip to seal his wound. Morte amici, debe mihi, gratias gratis sanguinem, quasque animus redire. He waited and watched while the 2 burgers watched over his shoulders. When the bodies began to wiggle slowly, he got a vial ready, and then carefully poked the back of one's left paw to draw blood, and the right paw of the other gathering their blood in the vial before sealing the little cuts with another cantrip. Then he stood as Bertha and Otto stared at him wide-eyed and open-mouthed. Necromancer! Bertha gasped, but Steve just sighed. No, fairy godfather, remember? I'm a good guy. This is good magic. Trust me. They actually seemed to settle down after that and then leaned in close to speak with each other quietly before Bertha nodded. Vine. But you better be right, or else you answer to me. She huffed and Steve just chuckled and nodded. I promise. Now then, keep those 2 apart. They might whine for food. Feed them by hand. Don't let them feed from the mother. It's nothing to do with death magic, I swear. Just see to it, okay, Otto? Yeah? Yeah. He nodded and answered for the kennel master as he walked past and clapped the man on the shoulder. When they headed back up to the shabby little throne room, Steve nodded to the king. Okay, now I just need to see your son to complete this. Complete what? The man asked as he got up from his nice chair. The gift, of course. I'm a fairy godfather. I can do no evil. Just trust me. He gave the king a big smile for a bit before the man nodded and waved for him to follow. Steve was beginning to suspect that so long as people thought he was a fairy godfather, he could suddenly do no wrong. Maybe he'd been going about explaining away his eccentric magic the wrong way all this time. They went down the hall he'd been in before, past the magic mirror room, and up a flight of stairs to another hall where he was led down to a large bedroom that Steve quickly realized from the big windows around the sides must be the very top of the keep. Gorgeous view, though. He nodded to the woman laying in the big four-poster bed across the way. "Greetings, Queen. Just your fairy godfather here." He pointed to the large wood crib to the side of the room. "Just going to gift your child here with fairy godfather magic. Don't mind this knife at all," he mentioned as he pulled his knife free once more. "Ah!" The king reached out, looking worried, but Steve just spoke louder. "I'm a professional godfather here. Don't worry, I swear it'll be great." The man slowly drew his hand back, chewing on his lower lip as he thought it over before nodding. "Okay, if you're sure." Steve really was beginning to wonder how far he could push this, but then focused on his task once more. "What is, its name?" he asked as he looked down at the baby in the crib that was wrapped in cloth and sleeping peacefully. "You can't tell?" the king asked. "No, babies are all fairly ugly. Yours is no more or less ugly than usual." Steve added, though, with a shrug. "His name is Ragos." The king told him, and Steve thought that over for a moment before snickering and then leaning into the crib, opening the vial of the dog's blood with one hand, while using the other to draw a small line across the child's head. It began to squirm and cry for a moment, but he poured the vial on the baby's forehead, rubbing it into the cut as he spoke, and made sure to absorb the pain at the same time, ignoring the pain in his forehead. "Adiuro tres unum sunt, semper fidelis, optimus cannabis, Ragos et dogos, tribus animabus mixtis." With that, he rubbed in the last of the blood and then healed the small cut and pulled back, tucking his knife back into his toga. "There! It's all done!" He beamed at the king. What is all done? You never said," the man mentioned as he adjusted the circlet that was his crown. "Oh, right. Well, there are now 2 dogs in your kennel who have their lives linked with your son. All 3 will grow together and give each other strength. They'll live as long as your son, and they'll be nearly immortal in the meantime. Not to mention they'll be great bodyguards and companions. How's that for a fucking gift, huh? Knocks that normal fairy shit out of the water, right? Am I right?" "I'm right." He nodded. That's actually pretty amazing. All I got as a child was the gift of song." Steve frowned as the man told him that, and he could obviously tell what he was going to ask. "Yeah, I can sing really well." "That's it? That's what your fairy godparent gave you?" He rubbed his chin as the king nodded slowly. "Well, that fucking sucks, man." He clapped the king on the shoulder, making him stagger a bit since Steve was considerably larger than him and hardened by his life of adventure. "Well, this should help make up for it. 2 undead guard dogs." Steve grinned. "Undead?" the king asked as Steve stopped grinning and coughed. What? Did I say undead? I meant super awesome fairy godfather dogs. Godfather magic. It's all legit. I swear. Hey, if the scribes from Orbitus call, make sure to tell them I did a good job. But don't tell anyone about who you got the gift from. Our little secret, okay? Okay. In fact, never mind mention my name to anyone. It'll ruin the magic." He looked around, then out the windows at the kingdom that the man before him ruled over. "What is your nation known for, anyway? Are you working on that bridge over there?" he asked as he pointed to a broken and crumbling stone bridge that connected the 2 halves of the deep mountain ravine. "That? What? No, that was an ancient bridge built by the first coalition of dwarves and elves. We have no idea how to build something like that. All we really make here is goat cheese." The king shrugged, his shoulders slumping a little, but Steve just smiled. "Oh, I love goat cheese. Mind if I take some home? And let me see about getting you in touch with some Almarin engineers. If there's one thing we know how to build, it's bridges that no one thinks are possible. And also aqueducts, temples, siege engines, roads, hospitals. Look, we're actually fairly proficient with engineering in general." He smiled. Yes. Goat cheese. Sure, of course. The king blinked as Steve began to walk him back down to his throne room. Oh, you guys are Frankomanian, right? Do you have those tasty meat blobs? Steve was hopeful he could get some of that. He was a damn good cook himself, but something about those mysterious spiced meat blobs. Donor? The king asked. Yeah. If you have any more kids, you just pay my fee and then pay me the rest of what you think is fair in food. Deal? He asked, and the king shrugged. Deal? He agreed, and Steve smiled, feeling very good about his new job, until he realized he might have to help a whole bunch of royalty. He liked helping out this guy because he was an underdog, and Steve was fond of helping the underdog, but he wasn't keen on having to help all sort of big, powerful nobles. What if that Kasurian asshole hired him? He needed to talk to the Archdean, but first goat cheese and donor. The Archdean still had the same body Steve had seen earlier, her form portraying the infinite cosmos that dominated the night sky, her eyes shining like two bright stars. Well, right now she had her head in her hands, but when those stars had been glaring at him and trying to burn holes in his face, he noticed they were very bright and star-like. Zombie dogs, Stephen? It's all legit, I swear! No soul entrapment! He tried to explain. It's still blood magic, she groaned. Life magic, he countered. You tied the souls of dead dogs to the firstborn son of a king. The Archdean sighed into her hands. They were only freshly dead. Their souls hadn't even wandered off yet. And he's only king of like 2 cities. I asked him about his army later and he said it's like 40 guys. Their primary export is goat cheese, which I did bring you some, by the way. I'm sure it'll be fine. Besides, you signed me up for this, you know. At a price point that should have scared off any noble in all of the disputed territories. She leaned up then to glare at him as he had to shield his eyes from her actually burning glare. Could you tone down the eyes a bit? He asked, and she sighed before her eyes faded to the intensity of full moons instead. Did they complain? Or did they give me a glowing review? The Archdean stared at him for several seconds before sighing once more. He gave you a glowing review. He just said he was thankful his queen was sleeping so he didn't have to explain why a strange man with a goatee was cutting her newborn child with a knife. She stared at Steve, but he just nodded. Ooh, that's why she didn't freak out she was asleep. I really should have noticed that, but I was focused on what I was going to cast. He nodded as she groaned once more. The fact that you're friendly enough with death to pull something like this off without a massive sacrifice should concern me. But yet I'm not surprised. Which should actually concern me more, shouldn't it? She asked. Hey, you're the one who wanted a pet adventurer with plenty of plausible deniability. He shrugged. Yes, speaking of, she mentioned and slid a scroll across her desk to him. I have some leftovers from the fairies who are now on strike. I want you to disrupt what they had established before they left. Oh? Steve asked, and picked up the scroll as he began to read. What the fuck is wrong with fairies? How many princesses have they put into a coma? Not mention their bizarre virgin fetish, them and unicorns, and they give shitty presents. Did you know the king's last godparent gave him the gift of song? How lame is that? And how does one actually give the gift of song anyway? What the shit kind of hack magic do fairies use? The gift of song is just a pitch-perfect tune rune, and a golden voice rune rubbed into the child's flesh with spirit water. If it's on an elf, the fairy will just refresh the rune after 700 years or so. The Archdean explained as Steve blinked. Oh, well, it's still lame. These are kings and queens. The gift of song, the gift of beauty. What sort of bullshit is that? They're already rich and powerful. People will want to fuck them no matter what. Why not a practical gift? Like the gift of tactics and strategy. Or shit, even the gift of military logistics. Now that would be useful for a ruler. He trailed off as he thought it over, but the Archdean spoke up. It's almost like they wanted to give nice yet meaningless gifts so they didn't horribly upset the balance of power in a region like a pair of zombie dogs. Steve looked back up as the Archdean's moon eyes glared at him, turning into crescents. Fair enough. He conceded, and then went back to reading the list. These assholes. Listen to all these conditional spell states. They pass it all off as fate or destiny, but it's nothing but slavery. He grumbled before looking back up at the Archdean. And I get to go undo all of this? You and Doom! She looked around for a moment, expecting something, but Steve just shook his head. It only happens when I do it. And you're sure you haven't made any pacts with the Dark Ones? She asked, and Steve sighed. Yes, I'm sure. I like to keep my brain intact and not flayed from within by the voices of the Dark Ones, thank you. He shook his head before rolling up the scroll. Right, I can undo all of this, but I'll need to do a bit of research. I know fairies love stories and use up a lot of the same tricks, but I'm not familiar with them. No? No fairy tales for young Stephen when you were growing up? She smirked, which made him sigh. No. The fairies in ElevenLabs didn't want to pay taxes, and there are only two main rules in Almera. One is shut the fuck up about your religion. You're free to practice it, but keep it to yourself. And pay your fucking taxes. So they didn't think they needed to pay. The Senate thought otherwise and began to hunt them down. So they left. The fairies stay the fuck out of Almeran territory now, which reminds me, this whole thing has made me think of some things we do back in Almera. You've got the fairies on strike right now, but we want them gone, right? Make sure that it's only mages who protect the royalty in human lands now, yeah? He asked, and the Archdean nodded. Yes. Ever since you burned down the library, I've realized it's important to build up the importance of Arbitus around the world to ensure we're too important to piss off. Right. He wondered if he was rubbing off on her, or if she was rubbing off on him. And if so, just how had he not noticed the Archon of Magic was so ruthless? Well, there are some Almeran experts I'd like to bring in. We're good at organizing things, and these guys know protection, so I think they'll be good to consult with. The Archdean thought this over for a moment and then shrugged. Sure, bring them in. Can't hurt to talk to them. Steve nodded and headed out to get ready to fulfill his newest mission. In time, the bards would come to vilify Steve's crusade against the fairies for the most part. But those in Francomanian lands would instead sing of his heroism and skill in replacing whimsy, which was so chaotic with a much more strict code of rules in due time. And the burghers love rules. But while those exploits were well known to the public in general, few understood how massively he would impact local politics. It went much further than giving a gift to the small, yet soon to grow, Uberberg. It went further than killing of scores of fairies who refused to obey the new rules or leave. It went beyond even his Almeran experts that he brought in. In truth, it was all of these things together and more. For the song of Spellslinger, the fairy godfather will have a very different take in some quiet Almeran restaurants in the years to come. For that song is about the man who accidentally organized crime in the eastern continents, but that is a story for another time.